Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. Look, it's with no pleasure that I rise today to address the bill, hot on the heels of a Labor opposition that appear to be doing nothing more than going through the motions and are no longer even really deserving of the name. This is a bill that is at once lazy and dangerous, and I'll go into my reasons for believing those things. Lazy because, as Senator Collins has quite rightly pointed out, since November 2013, the Australian government has had in its hands the Australian Law Reform Commission's report, quite a broad-ranging inquiry into how to update our antiquated copyright regime for the 21st century. And it's done, not only has it done nothing to address those quite sensible and far-reaching recommendations, it has cherry-picked an element that wasn't even canvassed in the report and brought that forward, because it gives it the impression of having done something, and it directly answers to its cashed-up donors and lobbyists, which is how we're well aware this government works. So it's dangerous, it's lazy from a policy point of view, and it's also lazy politics. It's dangerous because it does create the architecture of a second internet filter in this country. Senator Collins referred to it a couple of times as modest. Perhaps it's a modest little filter, but from little things, big things grow, and this is not the kind of growth that we would be supporting. I'll go in a moment into a bit of detail about the current state of play with site blocking regimes in this country. But maybe, just for some context, on the 17th of June, the Electronic Frontier Foundation in the United States, which is a leading advocacy organisation for digital rights in the US, pointed out the following. And this is in the submission to this bill that EFF put up. They said the following: as a bill purportedly meant to address copyright infringement, it is inevitably ineffective and offers little benefit. However, its detriment is very clear, that it further legitimises the practice of website blocking. This will make it more difficult for Australia to take a stand against these practices when practiced by authoritarian countries, and to resist pressure from domestic special interest groups to block more and more categories of content that they might find offensive or undesirable. Does anybody here in this debate, whatever side of it you may be on, whether it's this sort of stale bipartisan consensus down the other end of the table, or if it's up at this end, does anybody seriously believe that this scheme won't be expanded in the future to cover more categories of content? Of course it will. It has scope creep absolutely built into it. It is lazy and it is dangerous. And those who follow technology policy in this country might recall a forum that was held by the member for Wentworth, Mr Turnbull, in August 2010. And at that time, the Coalition, after the Greens and others had been campaigning for nearly 3 years, the Coalition had finally got on board with blocking Senator Stephen Conroy's much maligned internet filter. They had finally been persuaded by the strength and breadth of the campaign against the internet filter that they were going to oppose it. And of course that then leaves their opposition spokespeople off the leash to be able to say, that of course they thought that way all along. And I wasn't at this forum, but it was quite well written up. Paddington RSL, August 2010. Minister Turnbull, or opposition spokesperson Turnbull at that point, in quite a jovial mood, he said of the Labor Party scheme, the filter, it's dead, buried and cremated, and if it shows any signs of revival, it will then be exercised. And he said filtering is an idea which should have been put down long ago. It was simply not workable. It was a really bad idea that could only have come from people that didn't actually understand the internet. And that, I guess, is the kind of hypocrisy that tends to infect a debate such as this. From opposition, you can be against it once you've finally been persuaded by the strength of actual opposition in the community and amongst advocacy groups, but from government, here it comes. There was also the rather extraordinary debacle of an announcement of this government's filter in 2013 that I think lasted about 4 hours before it was knocked over. Mr Fletcher, some potential involvement of Mr Abbott. It appeared that Minister Turnbull was either blindsided or simply hadn't read the briefing materials that were put to him, that the government actually, or the opposition actually launched an internet filter proposal right before the election, and within about 4 hours it was dead. They'd backflipped and it was gone. And it's the kind of thing that nobody in their right mind announces in the run-up to an election campaign, but the government, knowing that the opposition is basically AWOL, feels reasonably confident that it can introduce a measure such as this. As I said at the outset, the government is setting in place not one but two filtering schemes, and both, in very different ways actually, are very interesting case studies of how not to regulate the internet. In the ashes of Senator Conroy's mandatory internet filter, where sites would be blocked against a rather poorly defined block list or blacklist of websites, Senator Conroy came up with another rather remarkable and expansive interpretation of Section 313 of the Telecommunications Act, which was basically, the interpretation was broadened to imply, quite directly, that a government agency under that section of the Act could fax, and apparently they do still use faxes, so who knew, a telecommunications company ordering them to block from viewing within Australia a site that they believe is breaching the law, the content thereon that breaches the law. And a House of Representatives inquiry set up into that scheme by Minister Turnbull recently rubber-stamped the practice and said, look, at some point somebody should get around to coming up with some guidelines, but in the meantime that House of Reps inquiry thought that it was fine that an unregulated internet filter, that an unknown number of government agencies could simply fax service providers and tell them to wipe out sites for a whole variety of different reasons, was appropriate. So at least the regime that we're dealing with today provides for court orders. We'll get to them in a moment. The law of unintended consequences already hit that Section 313 filtering setup pretty hard. ASIC already used it to accidentally wipe out about 250,000 named sites, not all of them active. In fact, I understand the majority of them simply parked, but just through a simple misunderstanding of how the technology works, 250,000 sites wiped out. And because the system is basically unregulated, there's no right of reply. There's nobody that you can call. The sites in question, or the operators of one of the sites in question that was wiped out by ASIC's enormous over-blocking attempt, ended up having to come to Parliament to find out where the website had gone and why it couldn't be served within Australia anymore. And so what we see from the way that this bill is written is that the government simply either doesn't understand the technology or, perhaps more likely, just doesn't care. The second filter that we are legislating today, that the Greens will be opposing, isn't going to be used by the government to block whatever website it wants, and that's a very, very important difference. It will instead be used by copyright holders and rights holders to block whatever website they want. So let's go through a few of its failings more directly. During the inquiry into the bill, major companies including Amcom, iiNet and Google, and even some of the bill's supporters, emphasised that blocking websites will not stop people from accessing content. Amcom and iiNet both put in their submissions site blocking is unlikely to be an effective way of dealing with online copyright infringement. And Google said there is increasing evidence to suggest that site blocking is not the most effective means of stopping piracy. They didn't leave it there, obviously, because there are a lot of good ideas on the table for how to stop piracy. If people are determined to pirate it, it's very difficult to stop them. There are dozens of ways of getting around a website being blocked, ranging from using a virtual private network or a VPN, to using one of many streaming apps or websites, or just getting a hold of the files on a USB stick and running them from there. Choice noted in its bill inquiry submission circumventing a website block is not very difficult. The only effective way really to deal with copyright infringement on the kind of scale that the government is concerned about is to just make it available conveniently and affordably and in a timely way. The distribution model, where you could sit on your distribution, your 20th century distribution bottleneck, and put a property up on screen, and then wait for 2 months and do the TV release, and then wait another 2 months and release it on DVD. That model's broken. That model worked before the internet existed. And rather than coming up to speed with that fact and offering content in a timely and convenient and cost-effective way, The rights holders, who have collectively donated around $4 million to those parties who are today championing their cause, the rights holders have called on the government to legislate. And they finally found a pushover of an Attorney-General who's doing so, and an opposition too weak to be bothered to turn up to the fight. We know this because the House inquiry into IT prices in Australia identified the ways of wiping out copyright infringement is quite simply just make the content available, and then people will use those appropriate channels. The House inquiry into IT prices, which looked into the sort of so-called Australia tax, where content providers and software developers and others treat Australia as this kind of island market where they can charge much higher prices, they can release stuff much later, and when that falls down and people then take the step of infringing copyright, these very same interest groups, having written out their cheques to the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, come in here expecting legislation for their benefit. And that inquiry recommended, for example, that consumers have a right to use evasion techniques to access geo-blocked content from being accessed in Australia. I don't actually think this is an issue that's going to be particularly controversial. Minister Turnbull has been pretty upfront. He says avoiding geo-blocking techniques shouldn't be illegal. The IT prices inquiry certainly found that it shouldn't be. So I propose to test goodwill on that proposition by moving an amendment when we get to the committee stage. And of course the government hasn't responded to that report either. And so what we see again is that element of laziness. Bring forward a site-blocking mechanism, but don't deal with the broader, more nuanced elements of the way copyright policy needs to change to stay up to date with what technology is doing. And the launch, I think, if you want evidence that people are willing to pay for content and won't pirate it if it's available, is the launch of Netflix in Australia not that long ago, which has seen an extraordinary take-up in service. So 1 month after its launch this March, Netflix has reportedly now accounts for a quarter of iONet's traffic. They're struggling to keep up. They're hardening up and improving their infrastructure. A quarter of iONet's traffic, according to one report that I saw, is now people using Netflix, people paying for content. People who weren't able to access this material through other channels are now stampeding through iONet, and I'm presuming Telstra and others are seeing the same on their traffic. So it is lazy legislating. If you want people to stop ripping stuff off, and I'm an artist, I come from an arts background, I want artists to get paid, particularly Australian ones. If you want that to happen, make it available. Stop trying to pretend that it's still the 20th century and that the internet doesn't exist. And if experience has taught us anything, we get this ineffective site-blocking regime, which I think has quite dangerous seeds within it for expansion and scope creep. And on the other hand, this mechanism that now exists, every filter that has been tried or trialled has had unintended consequences and overblocking. Labor's first internet filtering scheme quite notoriously listed the website of a Queensland dentist and a tuck shop consultant on its blacklist. ASIC, as I said before, inadvertently knocked over 250,000 sites. The Parliament's own internet filtering scheme. I suspect there's not a senator or staffer in this building who hasn't seen the Parliament's block list message for some piece of content that might have a word taken out of context. It blocked News Limited's former website, The Punch. I'm not even sure why. I've had similar experiences with other completely harmless sites. These things are actually very difficult to keep accurate, given the amount of the volume of content that's out there. The Australian Christian lobby already called for the filter to be extended to cover completely legal pornography sites. So I know not that many people take them all that seriously, although some in the coalition probably still do. So arguably they might be seen as a voice from the fringe and someone not to pay too much regard to, but they do have very senior access to Liberal Party spokespeople and ministers, and they propose they called it a no-brainer, a clean feed, a mandatory clean feed. And if you want to see categories of content that the Australian Christian lobby doesn't like, you'd have to put yourself on an opt-in list. You'd have to be listed as wanting to see things that the Australian Christian lobby disapproved of. Now, I understand that they may be seen as voices from the fringe, but that was a serious proposition that they put forward as they welcomed Mr Turnbull and Senator Brandis's announcement of this. Speaking of voices from the fringe, Senator McDonald, I'm so looking forward to your contribution. I'll hurry along because I know you're very eager. Both the Communications Minister and the Shadow Attorney-General have stated that the bill is not intended to catch legitimate services like virtual private network providers, but the bill doesn't make it clear. Again, I'm hoping this is a relatively uncontroversial amendment. VPNs have a very wide variety of legitimate uses, and I think it's extremely concerning that this bill has left vague the fact that it may be possible for a court to decide that the primary purpose of VPN services is to facilitate or to infringe copyright. The structure of the bill makes it very clear that at least after the first several actions, it's very unlikely that these blocking injunctions that will come, most likely from foreign rights holders, will be blocked either by the affected website owners who may be based overseas and they're not necessarily going to want the expense of defending an Australian legal case, or the ISPs. So why would your service provider, particularly after the first couple, we can assume some goodwill here, but maybe not hope that it would extend too far, why would the service providers be fronting up expensive legal cases in defence of their users? IINet did that. They took that all the way to the High Court, and IINet has been quite ferocious in defence of their users' privacy. This bill appears designed to circumvent that kind of goodwill and make it very expensive or very costly in the future. The experience in the UK, where a similar regime prevails, shows that ISPs are likely to only contest the first few injunctions before waving through most of what comes afterwards. And that, again, to foreshadow, goes to why we proposed in another of our committee stage amendments that much wider standing should apply, so that the courts can hear from affected third parties or others who might want to put either a public interest point of view or have a private interest, even though they're not the ISP or somebody more immediately affected. So, for example, if you use a cloud hosting provider, or if you use a particular service for business purposes, and you suddenly find one day that it's been wiped out and that you can no longer reach it, you may have nothing to do with breaching copyright, but a court somewhere has decided that it was facilitating copyright infringement. And what right do you have to contest that application in court if your private data is no longer available to you or your business in this country? That is the kind of risk that we're playing with here. So when it comes to the end of this debate, and I understand very few speakers have been put forward, we will be moving a second reading amendment, and I'll foreshadow, and I'll move that now for voting later in the debate, that this debate should be adjourned. It's quite similar to an amendment that the Labor Party moved in the House, and it is again a little bit similar to what Senator Collins foreshadowed, except that our debate would have our amendment would have some practical effect. It's not rhetorical. We propose that this bill debate be adjourned until the government has responded to the ALRC's review into copyright reform of November 2013. Senator Collins name-checked it on the way through, and quite rightly so. That is where this agenda was last canvassed, in a reasonably broad and consultative way by people who weren't simply owned by the rights holders. $4 million in donations to the major parties. That is not something, that kind of influence is not something that the ALRC was subjected to. So I hope that we will get support that this debate should not proceed, and the vote should certainly not proceed until those bigger issues have been looked at. I think, as I said at the outset, this bill combines elements of laziness and it is also dangerous, and it is not something that we should be rushing forward. It's a bill that, in my view, appears designed to expand down the track. So I would call on the Labor Party this afternoon to actually be the opposition and try and hold this government to account for a change, in defence not just of the unintended consequences, but of the quite real consequences of passing the bill in its present form.
Thank you, Senator Ludlam. And Senator